Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier, and thank you for taking time out of your day to stop by. I do appreciate it. I did an interview day before yesterday with Bob Collymore, the CEO of Safaricom, and has presided over more than 4.5 times increase in the share price in 48 months that he's been at the helm. I'll put up a photograph of his office as we set up, and he was in a meeting next door. And they say you learn a lot from how somebody keeps their desk. I won't show you mine, which is pretty messy. Macro thoughts. We're in a little bit of a profit-taking mode for the dollar, but I still am of the view that I was on August 25 when I said if things tip big, the dollar might soar. And I think, as I said on the 29th of September, I think the dollar has just started getting going. And there will be a lot of blood in the water, and there's a small window if we want to be sharks. And I said this time last year the US was printing $85 billion a month under its quantitative easing program. And the party was in full swing, like in The Great Gatsby, in which author Scott Fitzgerald writes, "In his blue gardens men and girls came and went like moths, among the whisperings and the champagne and the stars. The punch bowl just kept on giving. Well, next month the entire QE program gets wrapped up. The markets have been wrestling with some serious hangover effects." I have a call to action, and I'm aggregating and buying one-year calls. Home thoughts. I turn to Salman Rushdie, who wrote a super collection of essays which doesn't get much ventilation, called Imaginary Homelands. And in this he says, "Go for broke, always try and do too much, dispense with safety nets, take a deep breath before you begin talking, aim for the stars, keep grinning, be bloody minded, argue with the world, and never forget that writing is as close as we get to keeping a hold on the 1,001 things, childhood, certainties, cities, doubts, dreams, instances, phrases, parents, loves that go on slipping like sand through our fingers." He also said, and this is another one of my favorite quotes, "Ours is the most cryptic of centuries, its true nature, dark secret." Niall Cohen is on Capital Radio tomorrow, and he's the manager at Mount Kenya Safari Club and a friend, and everyone is tweeting him up about his interview tomorrow on Capital Radio. So in a kind of Pavlovian reaction, that hullabaloo on social media took me back to one of my favourite places in the world, which is the Fairmont Mount Kenya. I'll put up a photograph of drummers who regaled us one afternoon, and they really had groove, these guys. I'll put up a link to a piece which I was writing about the Fairmont and the Mara, but I started by touching on the Mount Kenya Safari Club, saying that it was founded in 1959 and became a mecca for the international jet set. The property sits on the slopes of Mount Kenya. I've sat at the bar and half expected William Holden or Adnan Khashoggi to pop in. My most intense memories of discovering a complete film studio on the grounds and walking around in the evening light alone. Sorry about that. I'll also put up a photograph of Hannah horse riding at Fairmont Mount Kenya a while back, and it really is a very dreamy and wonderful place. And finally, a photograph of the peaks of Mount Kenya, which I took, and somehow I got some green light reflected in the photograph, and it made me remember that piece in The Great Gatsby when he's forever yearning for the green light. Julia Pierson, the Secret Service Director, resigns under pressure about breaches. Washington. Julia Pierson resigned under pressure as Director of the Secret Service on Wednesday after failing to quell a bipartisan political furore over repeated breaches of White House security and losing the confidence of the President, her agency is charged with protecting. Miss Pierson's support in the West Wing began crumbling late Tuesday, in large part because she did not tell the White House of a security failure in Atlanta last month, when an armed man was allowed to ride in an elevator with President Obama at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And then, of course, an armed intruder jumped into the White House fence on September 19th and made it as far as into the mansion at the East Room. I concluded by saying, when you've sat and studied something like the assassination of John F. Kennedy, which I did, admittedly, belatedly, quite recently, and realized how there is surely an organ grinder somewhere who can kill a president stone cold dead, and then spin a narrative and spin it real good for 50 years. Therefore, this is not a series of lapses, this is a series of messages, in my opinion. Put up an image of an Austrian organ grinder. Let's turn to Hong Kong. China's Communist Party has warned of unimaginable consequences if demonstrations by pro-democracy campaigners in Hong Kong continue. The threat made in the party-run People's Daily came as China's government appeared to be losing patience with the protesters, who have threatened to occupy government buildings unless the city's chief executive, Lon Jun-ying, resigns by the end of today. An editorial read on state TV called for people to support the government's efforts to deploy police enforcement decisively and restore the social order in Hong Kong as soon as possible. I think such a move would be really very short-sighted and mark the beginning of a serious unraveling. Business Week, somebody saying, after all, Chinese leaders will behave reasonably and won't risk a repeat of Tiananmen-style crackdowns. I would hope not. However, President Xi Jinping, would he order the People's Liberation Army to fire on student protesters in a Tiananmen-style crackdown? No way, Lau said in an interview. The people will not allow it. The world will not allow it. I think Beijing is the one who can't afford a misstep now. Put up an image of Hong Kong protests, and it took me back to Mao Tzu by Don DeLillo and The Future Belongs to Crowds. Crowds featured very heavily in that book. It takes me back to, the crowd, the ability of the crowd to topple somebody. In predicting an age of terror in which the major work involves mid-air explosions and crumbled buildings, Don DeLillo was eerily ahead of his time in contemplating the profound effect that political terror was soon to have on American society. It's a super book, and well worth looking at. It says, two pictures would represent the polar extremes of Mao Tzu, the arch-individualist and the mass mind, from the mind of the terrorist to the mind of the mass organization. In both cases, it's the death of the individual that has to be accomplished before their aims can be realized, which is an important point. I'll put up a photograph of Tiananmen Square. I'll put up another photograph of a protester in Tiananmen Square in 1989. China has warned the US not to meddle in internal affairs. The United States and China have clashed over the pro-democracy protests sweeping Hong Kong, with Beijing warning Washington to back off, saying it would not tolerate illegal acts. The Chinese government has very firmly and clearly stated its position. Hong Kong affairs are China's internal affairs, Wang Yi told his American counterpart John Kerry. All countries should respect China's sovereignty, and this is a basic principle of governing international relations, Wang said. I believe for any country, for any society, no one would allow those illegal acts that violate public order. That's the situation in the United States. It's the same situation in Hong Kong. Put up a photograph of John Kerry with Wang Yi, who was actually quite forceful in the way he addressed those points. Of course, I'm of the view, as I expressed in my piece, the pivot to Asia bears its fangs. That I see the pivot to Asia as the encirclement of China, then the shrinking of its operating theatre, then lighting the tinderbox that is the periphery, of which Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and many more belong. And he took me back to 24th of October 2012 when I was quoting the crowd. We are not afraid, we're not afraid, we're not afraid, we're afraid only of God. The crowds chanted in Tunis in January, a few days before Tunisia's Zine al-Abidine fled. I put up a photograph of the crowd celebrating the fall of Gaddafi in the eastern city of Benghazi. This sentence caught my attention from the New Yorker. Not only was he not George W. Bush, who was a black president with the middle name Hussein, who had opposed the Iraq War and spent time in places like Indonesia and Pakistan. Apparently the A-10 Warthog gets one last mission against the Islamic State. And then I like this quote by George Monbiot: "Yet our politicians affect to learn nothing, insisting that more killing will magically resolve deep-rooted conflicts. They scatter bombs like fairy dust." Reuters is reporting his whole family was screaming as he got outside. He was throwing up all over the place 2 days after he was sent home from a Dallas hospital. The man who was the first person to be diagnosed with Ebola in the US was seen vomiting on the ground outside an apartment complex as he was bundled into an ambulance. His whole family was screaming. He got outside, he was throwing up all over the place. The hospital cited the man's privacy as the reason for not identifying him. New York Times said that Duncan, in his mid-40s, helped transport a pregnant woman suffering from Ebola to a hospital in Liberia, where she was turned away for lack of space. Duncan helped bring the woman back to her family's home and carried her into the house, where she later died, the newspaper reported. 4 days later, Duncan left for the United States. Death toll from the world's worst Ebola outbreak on record reached 3,338, but the World Health Organization saying this is probably a big undercount. And then an interesting report on global research saying, and it begins with the Public Health Agency of Canada, which as recently as August 6th stated this on its website: "In the laboratory, infection through small particle aerosols has been demonstrated in primates, and airborne spread among humans is strongly suspected, although it has not yet been conclusively demonstrated." There you go. Currency 126.59 euro dollar. Touched 125.71 on September 30. That was the strongest level since September 2012 for the dollar against the euro dollar index. A little bit soft, 85.60. Japanese yen 108.66. Remember, topped 110 yesterday, 110.09. Swissy 0.9536. Pound 162.35. Aussie back above 88 at 88.08. India rupee 61.621, South Korean won 1058.35, Real 248.52, Egyptian pound 715, South African rand 1122.08. Japan's currency fell 0.4% in the past month. New Zealand dollar worst performer, sliding 2.6%. Aussie 2.4%. The dollar's climbed 3.4%. You know, I think the dollar's going a lot higher. I'll put up a 3-month chart of the dollar index. This might be a little air pocket where we can get back in. Euro dollar, I'll put up a 3-month chart. I think that's going to break down towards 120. Interesting chart of the day from Bloomberg. Yahoo's market value is lower than the combined value of its holdings in the Chinese e-commerce company Alibaba and Yahoo Japan Corporation. It's a strange situation. Gold had a little bit of a bounce, 1221.235. I think it's a dead cat bounce. I think it'll be going down again. Crude oil came off yesterday, traded as low as 90.73, which is the lowest low since April 2013. Prices are down 7.9% this year. This is a flood of American exports or displacement of crude oil imports into the United States, having to find a home. 88.50 is key support here. We're just $2 above it. Richest African presidents pegs Jose Eduardo dos Santos with a net worth of $20 billion. Probably high in my view. Stephen Asimwe, the chief executive of the Uganda Tourism Board, announced a plan to create an Idi Amin tourism trail. There's a thought. South African all shares up 5.6661% in 2014, but it's corrected now. 3,367 points since July 29th and is at 5-month lows. Dollar rand, a little bit firmer for the rand at 1121.97. Egyptian pound, where it's been for a long time, 715. Egypt's Kala Holding, which was previous Citadel Capital, eyes $560 million capital boost. Dr. Armin Heikel was the chairman of Citadel, now of Kuala Holding. Egyptian stock market eased 0.67%, but it remains 43.689% higher so far this year, not far off 10,000 either. Nigerian all share, that's negative 0.2879% in 2014, but at a 3-week high. Good Luck Jonathan said in a broadcast on state TV to mark 54 years of independence from Britain, our security forces continue to engage the terrorists in battle. Driven by patriotic zeal, they are turning the tide, inflicting devastating blows at the heart of terror, he said. For the first time, credible opposition in Nigeria has come together. This is Buhari in a campaign speech on Tuesday. Buhari said Nigeria was saddled with a perilous security situation, extensive and almost unmanageable corruption, and pervasive lawlessness. Nigerian central bank is selling dollars to stem the naira slide, and the bank says they're in a comfortable position to defend the naira with level of external reserves and investment inflows. Gross reserves have fallen 9.3% this year to $39.56 billion. Ghana Stock Exchange is at 3-week lows. It's up 3.449% this year. Ghana is said to raise farm gate cocoa price 51%, so that will be good. Angola has raised fuel prices to ease subsidy and free social spending. Increase the retail prices for gasoline and other fuels to have more income to spend on poverty alleviation programs. Cost of a litre of gasoline rose 25%. Diesel increased 20%. Now, these are always desperate moments, but somebody says, difficult moments for any government. Is somebody saying that the security forces would be likely to suppress any planned protests, making any escalation unlikely. Nonetheless, isolated protests may occur in the transport sector. DR Congo Ebola outbreak has killed 42 since August, apparently. I'll put up a photograph of a medical staff member wearing a protective suit walking past a crematorium. However, that's taken, I think, in Liberia. I told Bloomberg that I think inflation has likely peaked, creating room for the central bank to keep interest rates on hold at its last meeting this year in November. IMF says Kenya's new economic numbers show reforms are working. Upward revision of Kenya's economic output shows that the country's economic reforms are paying off, with the potential for future growth to exceed 6% a year. That's what the IMF is saying. Armando Morales, the IMF representative in Nairobi, said the new numbers ended the puzzle of why economic reforms in recent years were not being reflected in more robust growth numbers. Now we have found confirmation that using better statistics, these reforms have been translating to growth. Our perception was of a booming economy, an economy ready for takeoff. IMF will visit Nairobi this month to discuss the government's request for an insurance-type lending facility to cushion against unforeseen shocks. Safaricom is up 23.68% on a total return basis this year. If you haven't seen the interview that I did with Bob, have a look at it. We're going to slice and dice it a little bit more, but it was pretty wide-ranging and covered everything. Nairobi All Share is up 20.182% within 0.73% of a record high set on the 23rd of last month. NSE 20, 139 points below a 6-year closing high, above 5,400, set on the 22nd of last month. Cadbury is to shut its Nairobi factory at the end of the month. That's not a good sign. And then going back to the markets yesterday, Nairobi All Share rallied 0.477%. NSE 20 firmed 11.93 points, shilling around this 89.40 level. Kenya Orchards now up an incredible 2,566% since the start of the year, when it had a market cap of $434,000. Today the market cap is $11.519 million. Safaricom firmed 0.39%. It's at a 2-week high. Longhorn, that's rallied a blistering 86.66% since releasing full-year earnings on the 25th of September. Equity Bank heavily traded, up 64.22% in 2014, but has corrected 15.126% of a record closing high reached on the 22nd of last month. Everready, of course, had that startling rally of 78.18% day before yesterday, closed unchanged yesterday. BAT surge 2.79%. That's returned 52.91% on an absolute return basis so far this year. Market is well supported. Interesting developments in that these small caps have really been a big outperformer this year at the NSE. Thank you very much.